This is a pretty straightforward question. Really, it's a variation on the perennial what caused the Civil War? Trouble is, you only get 45 minutes to answer, and 15 of those are spent reading the question and outlining. So you can only choose to make a few points about this huge topic, and the documents will inevitably direct those choices. On the other hand, if you let the documents drive your analysis entirely, or if you rely on them wholly for factual support, the College Board sticks you with a big penalty. As a starting point, the question asks you to focus on compromises, and this period is littered with specific compromise agreements. Some of them are labeled compromise, some aren't. This suggests that in organizing your essay, you basically have two good choices. One is chronological, which is also, by the way, how the documents themselves are organized. While the earliest document, interestingly enough, is dated 1833, the first great compromise dates from 1820, or the beginning of the College Board's designated period. I see that as a clear invitation and maybe, in fact, a command from headquarters to explain the Missouri Compromise briefly, not least because all subsequent compromises extend from the Missouri Compromise or amend the Missouri Compromise or finally sound the death knell of the Missouri Compromise. The other organizational approach you could choose is to pick 3 reasons the compromise failed and run with them. 2 is too few, in my opinion. 4 could work, and it would have the virtue of being a little different. 5, to my mind, would become unwieldy. I'm going to try to model both approaches. I will mostly review the period chronologically, relying heavily on the events that the College Board singles out in the list of relevant outside information that it provides to graders. At the end, I'll recap and talk about some possible themes. Note, this podcast and the accompanying slides and notes are a substitute for the detailed comments that I usually insert on turnitin.com. Sorry about that, but my art history commitments have really cut into my time, and I also think this may be a more useful approach, especially since I didn't have the opportunity this time to meet with the class in advance to talk about the topic. Now, in my view, at least, the issues part of the rubric is a little misleading. Yeah, sure, tariffs were an issue, and Document A does refer indirectly to the tariff, since Henry Clay's speech addresses the 1833 nullification crisis that's sparked by the tariff. Let me just note, by the way, the documents do not include a lot of explanation. This particular question really requires you to know the events so that you can identify what's happening in the document, which means it's particularly important that you introduce and explain the documents clearly and don't just throw out a document letter. I'm not going to be including that comment over and over again in the essay, although I may sometimes put it into general comments. By now, you should know how to introduce documents in a DBQ. Any rate, back to the topic at hand. Even in 1833, the true underlying issue was slavery and the plantation economy that slavery supported. So really the question is asking, why did Congress find it progressively harder and finally impossible to reach a compromise on slavery? Attempts at compromise, on the other hand, is a key phrase in the College Board rubric, and it may be the key phrase. The College Board's guidelines for graders are mostly a review of a series of compromises. Note that, that the details of these compromises are alluded to but not really listed or even explained in the documents. Those are blanks you are expected to fill in, and they should account for a big part of your substantial and relevant outside information. If you didn't do that the first time around, you need to do it in your second draft. As always with the U.S. History DBQ, you want to pay close attention to the time range of the question and not just the time range of the documents. So the first document dates from 1833, but as I just noted, I think it's a real mistake not to talk at least briefly about the Missouri Compromise, especially since that's the opening event of the date range that the College Board provides. The election of 1860 is described graphically, I would say quite dramatically, in the final document, which delineates how compromise ultimately failed politically. But I'm going to begin my chronological review somewhat earlier. I do not recommend that you use scarce time talking about the Northwest Ordinance or the Constitutional Convention, although I do think that a brief reference to the origins of slavery compromise might be a good way to open your essay. In other words, might be a good opening hook. Still, this is really where our story begins, and so I'm going to begin there too. As I just noted, 1787 is well outside the question's time frame. But since you're exploring the question of why America ultimately could not reach a compromise on slavery, and since you have more than 45 minutes to compose a second draft, it's worth stopping to think about why the prohibition of slavery in the Northwest Territories passed by unanimous consent. In other words, every single Southern state represented in the Articles of Confederation government voted for it. Why? Well, there were some economic motives involved. Virginia's Articles of Confederation congressional delegation, for example, noted in speeches at the time that they did not want tobacco and indigo grown by competitors in the Ohio River Valley. And these crops seemed to require a slave workforce. The ordinance was also passed before the invention of the cotton gin, so the reign of King Cotton had not yet raised the economic stakes, and that's really important to remember. By the way, the cotton industry is not really addressed in the documents, and yet the economics of cotton production and sale really heavily influenced the motives and actions of Southern politicians, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. Also, the Northwest Ordinance included a fugitive slave clause. Now, that would also be an important element of the Constitutional Convention's compromise, as well as the Compromise of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Clause was important not only because the slaveholding states wanted help capturing runaways, but I would argue even more because it constituted an official acknowledgement by northern states that slavery was a legal institution in some places. If you think about it, proclaiming that slavery is abolished in some territories really also implies that it is not abolished in others. This, in the end, was the essence of all the compromises. Northern and southern states agreed to disagree and to place a geographical boundary on that disagreement. Pro-slavery Southerners would agree that slavery could be prohibited somewhere else. Anti-slavery Northerners held their noses and accepted that the slavery that did not exist in their own backyards, therefore wasn't in their face, that could persist somewhere else. When the leading politicians on both sides changed their minds about this bargain, compromise fell apart. And I guess actually that's really my thesis statement for this topic. Now, the Constitutional Convention is likewise outside the question's time frame, but I don't think it would hurt to mention briefly, even in your essays, that one reason why Congress adopted and the country accepted the Missouri Compromise is that the Constitution had already established the legitimacy of political horse trades that sacrifice some democratic principles to political necessity. So today, for example, Wyoming has fewer than 600,000 residents. California has more than 38 million residents. Yet, thanks to the Great Compromise, citizens of each state elect exactly and only 2 senators. That's really not equal representation. The same compromise ensured that the less populous southern states could still potentially preserve control of the Senate, and that turns out to be very important to our story. What compromise could be balder and more obviously an act of political expediency than counting slaves as 3/5 of a person? Really a bizarre fraction. It's also worth noting that the original version of the Constitution forbade any outlawing of the slave trade. Northern delegates simply wouldn't accept this. So the final version allowed Congress to abolish the slave trade after 1808, and Congress did so promptly, January 1st, 1808. Yet it's interesting, by that time, every single state in the Union had already outlawed the slave trade, and yes, that includes the southern states. Why? Well, slave trading was really considered heinous even by many slavery supporters. But there are other reasons why even Southerners opposed importing slaves. Virginia, for example, supported ending the slave trade in their own economic interest. By 1808, the state's major crop was no longer plantation-grown tobacco, which had exhausted the soil, or cotton, which didn't actually grow that well in Virginia. Virginia's major crop was, and I'm sorry, I find this offensive too, it was slaves themselves. Ending the slave trade pushed up the price of Virginia-bred slaves. And South Carolina, which had always been the political center of the pro-slavery movement and would remain the political center of the pro-slavery movement, actually abolished the slave trade in 1803, 5 years before it had to. After the Stono Rebellion, remember that one? Basically, the legislature decided that slaves newly arrived from Africa were too rebellious and their dangerous ideas infected other slaves. I'm just reminding you that motives and history were often complicated. Back when I taught AP government, many of my students were surprised to learn that returning fugitive slaves was actually a constitutional requirement. Again, it was part of the Great Bargain, the compromise that lay at the heart of the U.S. Constitution. This issue, too, is going to return a little bit later in our story. So you all remember the basic outlines of the Missouri Compromise, right? Put the detail into the essay. Don't assume, explain quickly. It just takes a sentence and you get your outside information cred, right? The most important question for the purpose of this essay, again, is why did this compromise succeed? It lasted 30 years, more or less. In political terms, that's a huge success. Now, I know that's not the actual question that the College Board poses. It says, examine why the compromise fell apart. But the flip side to that question really has to be, why did it succeed in the first place? Well, I've already suggested some reasons. Americans were used to thinking of slavery as a regional phenomenon, and they still cared a lot more about what happened in their regions than in the nation as a whole. That made a horse trade, Missouri from Maine, pretty easy. As long as the North and South expanded westward at pretty much the same rate, this solution would continue to work, especially if the number of slave and non-slave states remained the same in the Senate. Some other reasons why the Missouri Compromise succeeded. Cotton was bringing prosperity to northern factories as well as southern plantations. So actually many northern manufacturers and bankers benefited from the cotton land, and many northern bankers benefited from the cotton land boom. So there was actually a lot of northern economic stake in slavery as well. Abolitionism was not yet as widespread in the North, and in fact, legal discrimination against free blacks was really widespread. In Ohio and Indiana, to just give one example, free blacks could enter the state only if they posted a $500 bond. Now, at that time, $500 was an enormous amount of money. There were very few free blacks who were mostly workmen, artisans, farmers, etc. They couldn't afford that kind of money. The strongest political figures likewise favored compromise. I worry sometimes that the College Board in general, and maybe the way history textbooks are written, encourages you not to focus enough on the contribution of individuals. It used to be that the opposite was the problem. There was too much of a focus on sort of the great leaders and not enough on broader economic and social trends. I sometimes think, though, that has swung too far. It's very hard to overestimate the importance of the role of Henry Clay. He was the great compromiser. He was an enormously effective Speaker of the House, and it was very much in his political interest to craft a compromise. He wanted to be president. To do that, he had to get northern and southern votes. And to give him credit, he was an ardent nationalist who really believed in the idea of the United States at a time when most people, again, really still had more regional and state loyalties. But the Talmadge Amendment signaled troubles ahead. It passed the House only narrowly, but the population of the North and therefore Northern representation in Congress was growing faster than in the South. The South simply had to keep the Senate to protect slavery, and so there had to be an equal number of slave and non-slave states. Thomas Jefferson called the Missouri Compromise, or the debate over slavery in the territories, a fire bell in the night. It's a famous quote. It's actually included in the College Board materials. At this point, the flames were still small and weak, but they were there. I'm going to interrupt my chronological review of compromises for just a little bit to talk about cotton. Usually the College Board hones in on economic explanations, and it offers at least a couple of documents to support economic explanations. And this question, interestingly, is an exception. I think the slides on this, the statistics on this slide are fascinating. Admittedly, I'm an economics geek, but they don't really capture the most important development in the cotton industry, which was that cotton was a largely Western phenomenon. We don't think about Alabama and Mississippi as Western states, but in the early 19th century, they were the Southern equivalent of the Wild West. The most fertile and most productive cotton lands by far were found in the Mississippi Delta, and Texas became a big cotton producer as well. So the question of whether slavery would be allowed to expand westward was not just a fight over principle. The stakes were really high. So check out this map of current U.S. cotton production that I found on the internet. Notice that New Mexico, Arizona, and California are all major cotton producing states today, and that's just cotton. California's fruit and vegetable production is very labor intensive. Colorado, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico are dotted with mines. Why not employ slaves in mining and agriculture instead of, say, migrant workers? Or, as turned out to be the case in the West, immigrants from southeastern Europe. In other words, we should not naively assume that slavery simply never could have taken hold in the West, and therefore that Southerners were fighting over something that didn't really matter. Slavery, after all, had been widespread in the Spanish colonies, what we now call Latin America. Okay, back to compromises. This is the issue and the compromise that Henry Clay is discussing in the 1833 speech excerpted in Document A. It's really your only non-slavery document, and it's basically a tirade against South Carolina's nullification of the Tariff of Abominations. Document A does not make much sense, by the way, unless you surround it with some of this explanation. Again, let me emphasize, this DBQ should really demonstrate to you that you need to know the historical background for a document, and you need to explain it in your essay. Just quoting from these documents is not going to make them make any sense. So here again, strong leadership makes a huge difference. Andrew Jackson, was a Southwesterner. He was a slave owner, but he was above all an ardent nationalist. Henry Clay, he was from Kentucky and he was also a slave owner. In fact, one of the most famous slave freedom cases before Dred Scott involved one of Henry Clay's personal slaves. But Clay too was a nationalist. Basically, compromise fared better when the national or northern leaders mid-nation leaders were rather sympathetic to slavery, but completely unsympathetic to secession. This was also, frankly, an easier issue on which to find a compromise. It's easier to cut a tariff in half than it is to cut slavery in half, although the Missouri Compromise had tried. But note too, and I think this is very important, Jackson's willingness to use force quickly and decisively played a huge role in promoting compromise. I'm getting a little ahead of my story, but remember that even though his election had already provoked secession, Lincoln was not president yet when the first Southern states voted to secede and then fired on Fort Sumter. It was the weak and feckless James Buchanan who was still sitting in the White House. The secession vote came in December of 1860 under the constitutional arrangements of the time, which would be changed in the 1930s by constitutional amendment. Lincoln didn't take office until March. Those were the critical months. Now, Buchanan stated that he did not support secession, but he also stated he didn't believe the federal government could take any action against seceding states, which meant basically that they could secede. Might history have been different, and might Congress and the states have managed to cobble together another compromise if Buchanan had immediately mobilized the army and marched south? I think Lincoln would have responded differently if he had already assumed office. And Lincoln at this point was quite willing to reach a compromise that preserved slavery in the South, much as he personally disliked slavery. I'm sure you've talked about this in class. During the course of the Civil War, Lincoln's positions on slavery would shift in important ways, not least because the the sheer horror and bloodshed of the war persuaded him that something morally serious had to be gained at the end. But again, that's really getting ahead of the story and beyond the scope of this essay. Note, too, that the violent attack on Senator Sumner, depicted in document E, was widely supported in the South. At the critical juncture in 1860, Southerners were frankly more willing to resort to violence than Northerners, and that strengthened their position. I noted before that the heart of the compromise was an agreement to disagree. But another important element was an agreement not even to talk about the whole painful issue of slavery. It could only be a source of dissension. The immediate provocation for the gag rule, and I hope you all recognize the document C was the gag rule, was John Quincy Adams' effort to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. Now, Northerners were a lot more willing to put up with slavery they didn't have to see every day. The slave auctions in the district, right under the noses of Northern congressmen, was a constant irritant. But so, frankly, was John Quincy Adams, who was not known for his tact. I think he was a great man. Tactful he was not. So why this assault on free speech? Why did it keep passing in the House of Representatives? Well, the main answer is that Northern Democrats reluctantly supported it in an effort to keep the Northern and Southern wings of their party united. By the way, a critical figure here was Martin Van Buren, who was personally very much opposed to slavery and would eventually be an active abolitionist. But at the time, his main job was to be the Democratic Party boss, and was probably the most effective political party boss in history. Eventually, however, the gag rule became so unpopular in the North that Northern Democratic congressmen got in trouble when they voted for it, got voted out of office. And the idea really that an issue couldn't even be discussed was, after all, a fundamental attack on free speech, which was part of the Constitution, was a very highly valued element of American political culture. And this is another reason why positions on slavery hardened. Probably an even more important reason for hardening positions, though, was a changing religious climate. The first half of the 19th century was a fervently religious period in American history. These were the years of the Second Great Awakening, the huge expansion of evangelical denominations such as the Methodists, the rise of other groups such as the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists. So note that the first declaration of the National Anti-Slavery Convention, document B, begins with a reference to Scripture. Evangelical Christians in the North turned increasingly against slavery, and they were egged on by preachers such as Lyman Beecher, whose daughter wrote the highly influential Uncle Tom's Cabin, which itself was another game changer. Now, in the 18th and early 19th century, most Southern intellectuals had viewed slavery as at best a necessary evil, and they hoped and genuinely believed it was going to disappear on its own. Jefferson, for example, eloquently condemned slavery, although I would note he actually never freed his slaves. Madison and Monroe did actually free their slaves, although I think it's intriguing. Some of Monroe's slaves chose to remain as slaves rather than to be transported to Africa. Monroe was a huge supporter of the colonization movement, and the capital of Liberia was actually named after him. I digress. But by the mid-19th century, and especially after the bloody Nat Turner slave revolt of 1831, Southern Christian leaders had turned to defending slavery as a positive good, something that they claimed was supported in the Bible. I'm actually a little surprised that the College Board did not include one of these statements among the documents. It does have a document that talks about how Northerners were uncouth in comparison to gentlemanly slave owners. But there was also a lot of sermons, a lot of documents about how slave owners treated their workers much more decently than, for example, people who ran Northern factories. And that was not a completely baseless description. Slaves on Jefferson Davis's plantation at River Bend, by the way, which most people considered to be a model plantation, were very well treated, largely ran the plantation. And one of the reasons he had support in the South was his model of the Christian gentleman running a humanitarian farm with well-loved, allegedly, slaves was, that was the Southern ideal, if very often not the reality. Anyway, The Missouri Compromise was a big success. It lasted 30 years. The Compromise of 1850 was not. So I think this is the point at which the 2005 question really hinges. It's here that compromise begins to seriously disintegrate. And of course, the issue was really the same in 1850 as in 1820. What do you do about the newly acquired Western territory? Geography, though, made the issue tougher, as did the hardening attitudes I've just talked about. As we saw from the cotton production map, southern Mexican territories offered much better prospects for plantation economies and for slavery than places like, say, North Dakota. So let's look at a couple of maps. Here's the Missouri Compromise line. Note that most of the unorganized territory at this point was the north of the line, and note also that it would have divided California in two. Might have been a good idea. I mean, California is arguably too big a state to run, at least living here, I think it is. While that scary geography had to keep Southern politicians awake at night, there was virtually no settlement in the northern upper Midwest, and there wouldn't be really until the post-Civil War Transcontinental Railroad. So although it was a huge swath of land, it was actually less politically in play at the time than you might think. The lands acquired by the Mexican War were very much another matter. The dilemma for Southerners was that California was being settled by miners and farmers who, for the most part, opposed slavery, and it was being settled very quickly after the gold rush. Miners in particular did not want to compete with slave labor. Remember that slaves had worked most of South America's mines. And by the way, opposition of free labor, both, frankly, to slavery and to competition from free blacks, was an important element in this period. In the House of Representatives, Northern congressmen, egged on by their more fervently abolitionist constituents, twice passed the Wilmot Proviso. This banned slavery in any new territory that would be acquired from Mexico. By the way, it did not include Texas, which had been annexed the previous year. The Senate rejected the proviso, but the lines were now drawn. And there were other issues. As abolitionism grew in power, more people were willing to help runaway slaves. Meanwhile, the booming market for cotton was dramatically increasing the economic value of a slave. So basically, the stakes got a lot higher. I found this interesting chart in an economics article on the internet. I added the red lines to focus in on the period we're now discussing. The period between the onset of the Mexican War in 1846 and the onset of the Civil War in 1860 saw a huge jump in the economic value of slaves. These figures are in what economists call constant dollars. That means they've been adjusted for inflation. In this case, they've been adjusted to 2011 prices, so you can have some sense of this. In current dollars, a slave was worth about $80,000 in 1846. This is, of course, an average. It varied according to the age, skills, health, etc. of a slave. At the beginning of the Civil War, the value was about $120,000. So, and again, that's in constant dollars, so that doesn't reflect any inflation. Think about how you would feel if the economic equivalent of, say, 4 to 6 cars disappeared from your garage. Now, understand, please, I find slavery as abhorrent as you do, and as many in the North increasingly did. I do not consider human beings to be the equivalent of cars. Still, to comprehend why enforcing the fugitive slave law did so much to destroy compromise, you have to understand what was at stake economically. By the way, I've included in the notes a link to the economics article if anyone's interested in looking at the methodology. So Southerners were looking at congressional proposals, scared about congressional proposals to cut off promising slave territory from slavery, which before long would mean more senators from non-slave states, which would upset the balance in the Senate, which could lead potentially to the abolition of slavery even in the South. What was to keep Congress from voting to abolish slavery nationwide? The Constitution doesn't protect slavery. It does have the 3/5 compromise. It does have the slave trade provision that suggests that it accepted slavery, but there's nothing that says slavery cannot be outlawed. And even if it could be changed by constitutional amendment. And again, the North was winning the population race. Northern Democrats such as Stephen Douglas faced a big dilemma as well. They won presidential elections by winning a few northern states and the solid South. And you should keep in mind that Democrats held the presidency for all but 8 of the 32 years from 1829 until 1861. In other words, most of the period we're looking at. Whigs, first Zachary Taylor, then Millard Fillmore, controlled the White House when the Compromise of 1850 was actually being negotiated, but the Democrats wanted it back. To accomplish this, they needed a compromise that held that North-South coalition together. The other party, the Whigs, faced a dilemma as well. While the party included both Northern and Southern Whigs, many Northerners would no longer support a party that tolerated slavery. At a time when all the parties had some interest in hanging on to their Southern members, they had an incentive to reach a compromise. Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat, was especially desperate to keep his party united, so it would elect him president. His compromise proposal was popular sovereignty. The people of every state would get to choose for themselves. It sounds democratic, but it turned out to be a recipe for disaster. We're not quite there yet. Daniel Webster, a Northern Whig, was also trying to preserve the Union, but his defense of the Fugitive Slave Act, which you see in Document D, actually destroyed his reputation, pretty much ended his political career. He was more or less forced to resign from the Senate soon afterwards, and Northern politicians took note. Daniel Webster was beloved, respected, really the leading Northern politician, and his support for compromise brought him down and again really destroyed his reputation, which people valued very highly. So we're seeing a new breed of Northern and Southern politician emerging. They're represented by Abraham Lincoln in Document G, presenting his moral objections to slavery, his belief that ultimately it is incompatible with the American democratic model. We also see the cartoon of the violent Representative Preston Brooks in Document E, and I'm sure you read in your history book that after he beat Senator Charles Sumner with a cane, he was sent canes from all over the South so he could do it again. You also see the Georgia editorialist in Document F, who's talking about how uncouth and ungentlemanly people are. Basically, this comparison isn't completely correct because I would argue that Lincoln was more open to compromise than the other two documents, the people being described in those. But he would not go as far as Webster or Clay. But for now, Clay, Webster, and Douglas could still muster slim majorities. We're back to the Compromise of 1850, although in the end, they only had the votes, and this was significant, to pass these measures one at a time. They had to break the bill down into bits with different majorities for each provision. Grand Compromise now eluded Congress and congressional leaders. I think a very strong argument could be made that it was actually the Compromise of 1850 that destroyed the possibility of further compromise. Excuse me. I've sent Mr. Baca an article that makes this argument very well and is also, to my mind, really a model of excellent historical argumentation. This guy not only writes very well, but he really musters the evidence. Now, confession, this is a historian I not only deeply admire, but know personally, but I think many people would consider him to be sort of one of the outstanding American historians of slavery. So what Paul Finkelman, this is the author I'm talking about, argues is that the compromise made Southerners too confident. It overturned the Missouri Compromise. Popular sovereignty seemed to establish that states could choose slavery without direct congressional blessing. They got the Fugitive Slave Law. This success made Southerners more confident and less willing to compromise in 1860, especially, and we'll talk about this in a moment, when they got further support from the Dred Scott decision in 1857. But the new Fugitive Slave Law proved incredibly unpopular in the North, and it actually ended up turning a lot of fence sitters into abolitionists. As long as slavery stayed down south, and I've made this point before, Northerners, or at least a lot of Northerners, could ignore it, much as, frankly, we too often choose to ignore or at least avoid thinking about the many human rights abuses around the world. But when slave catchers traveled north and actually called on local police power to help drag people away, and by the way, these were often free blacks or they were escaped slaves who'd lived in the community, for decades, crowds rioted in response. They rescued these people. They fought the police. And it was also, frankly, hard to get some of the police to cooperate. People in the North were reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. That made them angrier still. These voters would no longer elect politicians who compromised on slavery. And that meant that opinion in Congress became further polarized. I mean, part of what you happened really is that the people who would make a compromise began to disappear. There was a kind of compromiser extinction going on. Popular sovereignty, moreover, proved a disaster. So we're getting near the end of our story. The Missouri Compromise lasted 30 years. The Compromise of 1850 fell apart almost immediately. I've talked about the damage done by the Fugitive Slave Law and briefly mentioned that the South won another seemingly huge victory in 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. Basically, it made slavery legal everywhere in the country. It said Congress can't abolish slavery. It read into the Constitution essentially a right to slavery. It also, by the way, drove Abraham Lincoln back into politics, not an insubstantial consequence. The bloodshed that followed on the heels of the Kansas-Nebraska Act also showed that the seemingly democratic notion of popular sovereignty provoked violence and mob rule. John Brown and his raids further inflamed hotheads on both sides. So again, we have a much greater willingness to resort to violence, which is another major reason why compromise fell apart. The Whig Party disintegrated. Northerners voted overwhelmingly Republican in 1860. The Democrats fatally split into three factions. Just look at that chart in your last document. And basically the coalition that elected Democratic presidents fell apart. In 1833, during the nullification crisis, South Carolina was not able to carry the rest of the South out of the Union. And in fact, there were substantial protests even in the hill countries in South Carolina that scared the South Carolina legislature. In 1860, a more assertive, more beleaguered, and more extreme South joined the South Carolina radicals, in part, as I've argued before, because it didn't look as if James Buchanan and his administration were going to do anything about it. And they were scared of Abraham Lincoln. They wanted to get out while the going was good. Okay, the reasons. I've talked about all these issues as I went through my chronology of the period, and frankly, this podcast is getting too long. I've also made reference to every document, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. If you've gotten this far, you're now going to hear a confession. I haven't read your essays yet. I'm turning to that now. That's how I always approach these questions, by the way. I read up on to refresh my memory of the history. It's been a while. I study the College Board's rubric and grading materials, and then I mull over how I would answer or try to answer the question. I put together some general comments for Turnitin.com, and then finally I turn to the essays. Well, as I said, art history is now devouring my days. Brief commercial break. Check it out on YouTube. You can Google Mary McConnell Art History. I think it's a fun course. We would love to encourage many of you, particularly your senior year, to take this. It's a fun course. Looks good on your college applications. I think you'd enjoy it. Anyway, commercial break done. So at any rate, I am not going to put these comments into your essays this time around. Instead, I'm going to insert some fairly general comments into the grading rubric, which I will copy into the general comments section of Turnitin.com on your essays. So you're not going to get as many comments from me, and you've really getting in this podcast and in the notes accompanying a sense of how I think you need to approach this essay. But if you have questions about your grade, or if you don't understand comments, or even if you just need advice about how to proceed, please don't hesitate to email me. It's mary.c.mcconnell@gmail.com, and that email is included in the notes. As always, I will share some observations about what I see in the essays. I will write a grading memo when I'm done. I know that you wrote this essay in class and under considerable time pressure. I'm actually not going to take that into consideration in the grade because I'm simply using the College Board grading rubric, and you're going to have to write them that way when you take the AP exam. But I do know that you have an opportunity to write a second draft, and you have a chance to get this, more thoroughly written or get it right even. Yes, you do need to move toward writing essays under realistic wartime conditions, in other words, under exam conditions. But do-overs are still an important exercise in improving your writing and analysis. So I think you do need to write a second draft. Good luck with it. And by the way, have a wonderful Christmas break.